3 days. That's how long my grandfather was missing. No phone calls, no texts, no trace. And the last place anyone saw him was a train platform. Now, before I tell you what happened, I need you to understand something about my grandfather. This wasn't some frail, forgetful old man who needed help crossing the street. This was a man who built his own house with his bare hands at 43. A man who never, not once in my entire life, asked anybody for directions. So when we realized he was gone, we didn't just panic, we broke. I want to tell you this story the right way, because it's not just a story about a wrong train. It's a story about a man I thought I knew completely, and how 3 days of silence taught me more about him than 27 years of living ever did. And honestly, it changed the way I see aging. It started on a Tuesday, one of those ordinary Tuesdays that you never expect will become the Tuesday you talk about for the rest of your life. My grandfather, Papa, we called him, had asked to visit an old friend, someone he grew up with, a man he hadn't seen in almost 11 years. We said yes, of course. What were we going to say? No? He was 79, not 9. He'd taken trains his whole life. He knew the routes better than most people half his age. So, we dropped him at the station. We hugged him. We watched him walk through those doors with his small brown bag and his gray flat cap, the one he wore everywhere. And we drove home. And that was the last we saw of him for 3 days. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever had that feeling, that quiet, creeping feeling, where you know something is wrong, but you can't explain it yet? That was us, that first night. He hadn't called to say he'd arrived, but Papa wasn't really a "I arrived safely" kind of man. So we told ourselves, he's fine. He's probably just catching up with his friend, laughing too loud, staying up too late like he always did. We told ourselves that, right up until the next morning, when his friend called us and said, "Papa never showed up." When his friend said those words, "He never showed up," I remember the exact feeling. It wasn't immediate panic. It was more like the floor shifted, like something underneath the normal world moved just slightly, enough to make you unsteady, enough to make you realize that everything you assumed was solid. My mom was the first one to speak. She said very quietly, "What do you mean he never showed up?" And his friend repeated it, gently, like he already knew what those words were going to do to us. He never came. I waited at the station. He wasn't on the train. Now here's the thing about a missing person situation that nobody tells you. The first hour isn't dramatic. It's almost embarrassingly ordinary. You make phone calls. You check the obvious places. You convince yourself there's a simple explanation, because the alternative is too large to look at directly. So we called his mobile, straight to voicemail. We called it again, voicemail. My uncle drove back to the train station. Maybe Papa was still there. Maybe he'd sat down somewhere. Maybe he'd just got confused about the time. He wasn't there. We called the friend again. We called Papa's neighbors. We called the one cousin he spoke to regularly. Nothing. 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 And with every unanswered call, that floor kept shifting. Can I tell you what the hardest part of those first few hours was? It wasn't the fear. Not yet. It was the guilt. Because every single one of us, every single one, was quietly asking themselves the same question. Should we have gone with him? He'd told us not to fuss. He hated being treated like he was fragile, and we respected that. We thought we were respecting him. But now, standing in my mum's kitchen, phones in hand, silence between us, we weren't so sure anymore. By the afternoon, we'd contacted the train station officially, and that's when we got our first real piece of information. The station had CCTV, and when they reviewed the footage from that morning, they found him, Papa, clear as day, walking through the station with his brown bag and his gray flat cap. He went through the turnstile. He walked down to the platform. And then he got on a train, just not the right one. Now you might be thinking, okay, wrong train, that's fixable. He realizes he gets off at the next stop. He calls someone. And yes, that's what should have happened. But here's what we didn't know yet. Papa's phone, the one going straight to voicemail, we found out later that he'd accidentally switched it off that morning. He didn't know. He thought it was on. He thought he was reachable. He wasn't. And the wrong train he got on? It wasn't a local train. It was an intercity express, no scheduled stops for over 2 hours. So picture this. My 79-year-old grandfather sitting on a fast train, watching the landscape change outside his window, slowly realizing that none of these towns look familiar. No working phone, no one beside him who knows him. Just a man, a brown bag, and the quiet horror of realizing you are going somewhere you did not choose. What do you do in that moment? What would you do? Because what Papa did, I'll be honest with you, it was not what I expected. And it tells you everything about who he really was. But before I get there, back at home, we had just found out about the inner-city train. And my mom, my strong, composed, never let them see you sweat mother, she sat down at the kitchen table, and she cried. I hadn't seen my mom cry since my father's funeral, 6 years before. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a problem we could solve with phone calls. That was the moment it became real. I've thought a lot about what fear does to a family, how it strips away all the things you perform for each other, the strength, the composure, the I've got it handled energy. And suddenly you're just people, scared people, who love someone and don't know where he is. That kitchen, that afternoon, that was us at our most human. And somewhere out there, on a train heading further and further away from home, Papa was about to make a decision that would define the next 3 days, and define him, to me, forever. So, where did that train end up? And what did a 79-year-old man do when he stepped off it, alone, in a city he didn't recognize? Let me take you out of that kitchen for a moment. Out of the fear, the phone calls, the crying. Let me take you somewhere else entirely. Let me take you to a train platform, a busy one, in a city none of us had ever visited. And let me introduce you, properly, to the man at the center of all of this. Because to understand what Papa did next, you have to understand who Papa was. My grandfather grew up with almost nothing. I mean that literally. He was the 5th of 8 children in a small town where opportunity wasn't something that came looking for you. You went looking for it, or you went without. He left home at 17 with a small bag, funny enough, not unlike the brown one he carried that Tuesday, and he built a life from the ground up, brick by brick, decision by decision. He always said the same thing whenever any of us faced something hard. He'd look at you, really look at you, and he'd say, "Confusion is just the beginning of understanding. Stay calm. Look around. Ask." We used to tease him about it. It sounded like something off a motivational calendar. But that Tuesday afternoon, on a platform in a city he'd never been to, with a dead phone and no plan, that's exactly what he did. The train pulled in. Papa looked out the window, and he didn't recognize a single thing. He told us later, and this is the part that gets me every time. He said his first feeling wasn't panic. It was irritation. He was annoyed with himself for getting on the wrong train. He said, "I sat there for a moment and I thought, okay, you've done something foolish. Now stop sitting here being foolish and do something about it." That was Papa. No spiral, no catastrophizing. Just, all right, next move. He picked up his brown bag, he straightened his flat cap, and he got off the train. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Papa stepped onto that platform and did the first logical thing he could think of. He found a person in a uniform, a young station worker, couldn't have been more than 22, 23 years old. And Papa walked up to him and said, very politely, "Excuse me, I am in the wrong city. Can you help me?" Just like that. Not embarrassed, not flustered, just a man stating a fact and asking for assistance. The young worker apparently stared at him for a moment. Because what do you say to that? But Papa just waited, calm, patient, like he had all the time in the world. And eventually, the young man said, "Okay, sir, where are you trying to go?" And Papa told him. And the worker's face. Papa said his face did something complicated. Because the city Papa was trying to reach was not 2 stops back. It wasn't even in the same region. Papa had somehow, through a combination of the wrong platform, the wrong line, and possibly the worst timing in the history of rail travel, ended up in a city that was 6 hours from where he started. 6 hours. In the opposite direction. I know. When we found this out later, my uncle actually said, "How? How does that even happen?" And honestly, we still don't fully know. The best explanation we have is that Papa, unfamiliar with that particular station's layout, followed a crowd of people onto a platform without checking the board. And that crowd happened to be boarding the one train going as far from his destination as physically possible. Papa, in his own words, described it as a very committed mistake, which, if you knew him, is the most Papa sentence that has ever existed. So, 6 hours from home, dead phone, no one who knows where he is. The young station worker, to his enormous credit, didn't just point Papa to an exit and wish him luck. He sat with him, right there on a bench on that platform. He helped Papa figure out the next train back. He wrote down the platform number, the departure time, the number of stops, everything on a small piece of paper in large, clear writing. And then he did something that Papa talked about for the rest of that trip. He bought him a cup of tea from the station kiosk. Didn't make a big deal of it. Just came back with 2 cups, handed one to Papa, and sat with him until he was sure the old man knew exactly what he was doing. Papa never got that young man's name. He tried to pay him back for the tea. The worker wouldn't take it, just smiled and said, "Safe travels, sir," and walked back to work. I think about that young man a lot. He didn't have to do any of that. He could have pointed Papa to the information desk and moved on. But he didn't. And because he didn't, what came next was possible. Because Papa made it to the right platform, he got on the right train. He was heading back in the right direction. He should have been home by nightfall. He should have been. But somewhere between that platform and home, something happened. Something that took a wrong train and turned it into a 3-day disappearance. Something that, looking back, feels less like an accident and more like something that was meant to happen. What stopped him from coming home that night? Papa was on the return train, sitting by the window the way he always did. He liked to watch things pass. Fields, towns, bridges. He said it helped him think. He had his piece of paper with the stop written on it. He had his brown bag on his lap. He had about 4 hours ahead of him before he'd need to change trains and get back on familiar ground. He was tired, but he was okay. And then, about an hour into the journey, the train stopped. Not at a station, just stopped, in the middle of nowhere. And an announcement came over the speaker, muffled, the way train announcements always are, like they're being read through a pillow. Something about a delay, a signaling fault, an indefinite wait. Papa looked out the window, fields, a gray sky, a single tree in the distance, and he thought, okay, this is fine, I'll wait. So he waited. An hour passed, then another. The carriage had thinned out at the last stop, so it was quieter now. A few people, scattered seats, and across the aisle from Papa, he noticed a woman, older, maybe mid-70s, sitting very still, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing in particular. Papa, being Papa, did what he always did with strangers. He said hello. She looked at him, a little surprised, the way people are when someone actually speaks to them on public transport. And she said hello back, and that was it. That was the door opening. Her name was Ada. She was traveling alone, had been visiting her daughter 2 cities over. First time she'd made the trip by herself since her husband passed, 8 months before. She told Papa this within about 15 minutes of conversation. Because that's what happens when 2 elderly people with stories get stuck on a delayed train together. The walls come down fast. Papa told her he'd gotten on the wrong train. She laughed, really laughed, and said that was the best thing she'd heard all week. He told her about his friend he was trying to visit. She told him about her daughter, about the grandchildren, about the house that felt too big now that it was just her. And Papa listened, the way he always listened, completely. Like you were the only person in the world, and whatever you were saying was the most important thing he'd ever heard. He had that gift. I've never met anyone else who had it quite like he did. The train eventually moved, 2.5 hours late. By the time it pulled into the next major station, it was late evening. Papa had missed his connecting train home, the last one of the night. The station staff told him the next available connection wasn't until morning. So Papa, stranded, phoneless, in an unfamiliar city for the second time that day, did the only logical thing. He asked Ada if she knew anywhere nearby he could stay the night. And Ada said, "You'll come to my sister's house. She lives 10 minutes from here. She won't mind. She never minds." Just like that. No hesitation. Like offering a stranger a bed for the night was the most natural thing in the world. And Papa, who had spent 79 years being fiercely, almost stubbornly independent, said yes. Now I need you to stay with me here, because I know what some of you might be thinking. A stranger, an unknown house, an old man who nobody could reach. And yes, when we found out about this part later, there were feelings about it. Big ones. But here's what Papa said when we asked him. Weren't you scared? Weren't you unsure? He looked at us like we'd asked him something slightly ridiculous. And he said, she was a grandmother. She had a picture of her grandchildren in her wallet, and she showed it to me before she told me her name. You don't fear people like that. And that was the end of that conversation. Ada's sister was called Miriam, and when Ada called ahead from the station to explain the situation, Miriam apparently said, without missing a beat, "How does he take his tea?" Papa arrived at Miriam's house that night to a warm meal, a spare room with clean sheets, and 2 women who treated him like he was family they simply hadn't met yet. He told us he sat at that kitchen table until almost midnight, talking, eating, laughing. He said it was one of the finest evenings he could remember in years. And I believe him. because Papa hadn't really laughed, not the deep, full kind, since my grandmother passed 2 years before. We'd noticed. We just didn't know how to fix it. Turns out a wrong train and a delayed journey did what none of us could. Here's the thing that breaks me a little, even now. My grandmother and Papa were together for 51 years. 51 years. And when she went, he didn't fall apart visibly. He didn't crumble. He kept going, kept functioning, kept showing up for all of us. But something in him had gone quiet. That's the only way I can describe it. Like a room in him had its lights turned off, and he'd just quietly closed the door to that room and carried on. We were so focused on keeping him okay that none of us stopped to ask if he was living. Ada and Miriam, two strangers on a delayed train and in a warm kitchen, reminded him what that felt like, and I will be grateful to them for the rest of my life. Papa stayed one night. That was the plan. But the next morning, Miriam made breakfast, and over breakfast, Ada mentioned that her daughter, the one she'd just visited, lived in a town about 40 minutes away. A town Papa recognized, because it was close to the village where he grew up, a village he hadn't been back to in over 30 years. He mentioned this, casually, over scrambled eggs, and Miriam looked at him and said, "So, why don't you go?" Just like that. Why don't you go? And Papa, who had said for years that he'd get back there someday, who had been saying someday for 3 decades, put down his fork and thought about it and thought about it and said, "You know what, I think I will." He didn't come home that night either, or the next, and when he finally called us, on a phone borrowed from a shop owner in a village none of us had ever visited, he wasn't lost anymore. He was somewhere he hadn't been in 30 years. He was home, a different kind of home. There's a particular kind of silence that only exists in the places we come from. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of memory, where every corner holds something. Every street has a version of you in it, younger, smaller, unaware of everything that's coming, where the air itself feels like it remembers you, even when everything has changed, even when you have. That's the silence Papa walked into when he stepped off that local bus and stood at the edge of the village he hadn't seen in 32 years. He told us he just stood there for a moment, just stood there, bag in hand, flat cap on, looking. He said the main road was different. New buildings, a paved path where there used to be a dirt one, a shop where an old field used to be. But the church was the same. The big mango tree at the bend in the road, still there. The hill in the distance, still there. And something in his chest, he said. Something loosened, like a knot he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. Just loosened. He started walking, no map, no plan, just his feet and 32 years of memory guiding him. He walked past the school he attended as a boy, smaller than he remembered, the way childhood places always are. He walked past the road where his mother used to send him to buy bread every Saturday morning. He walked past the compound where he and his brothers used to play until their mother's voice cut through the evening air, calling them in. He said he could hear her. Not literally, but in that way, you know that way, where a place holds the echo of someone so completely that for just a moment, time does something strange. And they're there again, just for a second, just enough. Papa lost his mother when he was 31. He never really talked about it. That generation, they didn't, did they? They loved deeply, and they grieved privately, and they kept moving because stopping felt like drowning. But walking those streets that morning, he talked to her. He told us this quietly, almost shyly, like he wasn't sure how we'd receive it. He said he just talked to her, out loud, walking, told her about his life, about our family, about the grandchildren she never got to meet, about losing his own wife, her daughter-in-law, 2 years ago. He said, "I think I needed to tell her. I don't know why. I just needed to say it somewhere she might hear it. I'm not going to tell you whether I believe the dead can hear us. That's not for me to say. But I'll tell you this. When Papa came back to us 3 days later, something had shifted in him. Something that had been closed was open again. And maybe that's all the proof any of us need." He found his way to the older part of the village, the part that hadn't changed much, the part where the houses were older, the trees were bigger, the pace was slower, and he stopped in front of a compound, a faded blue gate, a guava tree leaning over the wall. He knew this place. This was where his oldest friend had grown up, a man named Joseph. Not the friend he'd originally been traveling to visit, a different one, a childhood friend. Someone he'd lost touch with gradually, the way you lose touch with people, not through any argument or falling out, but just through the slow accumulation of distance and years and life. Papa hadn't spoken to Joseph in almost 20 years. He stood at that gate for a long time, thinking. Then he knocked. A young woman answered, maybe 30 years old, cautious, the way people are when a stranger knocks. Papa apologized for the interruption, introduced himself, asked, very gently, whether Joseph still lived there. The young woman looked at him for a moment, and then her expression changed. Something moved across her face that Papa couldn't quite read. She said, "Your Papa. He talks about you. He still talks about you." And Papa, who had held it together through wrong trains and strange cities and sleepless nights and 32 years of a door he'd never walked back through, Papa's eyes filled with tears. Right there at that faded blue gate, under that leaning guava tree. He didn't try to stop it. He just let it come. Joseph was inside. He was unwell, had been for some months. Nothing immediately dangerous, but enough to slow him down, enough to keep him close to home. When the young woman, his granddaughter, brought Papa through to the sitting room, Joseph looked up. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. 2 men, late 70s, carrying between them a friendship that had started when they were boys, with no shoes and no idea what life was going to ask of them. And then Joseph said, "You look old." And Papa said, "You look worse." And they both laughed, the way only old friends can laugh, from somewhere deep and unguarded and completely free. Papa stayed. Of course he stayed. Joseph's family fed him, gave him a room, welcomed him with that particular generosity that some families just have, where a stranger at the door is never an inconvenience, always a blessing. And for 2 days, Papa and Joseph sat together. They talked about everything, their childhood, their families, the people they'd loved and lost, the choices they'd made, the ones they wished they'd made differently. Papa told him about my grandmother. Joseph told Papa about his own wife, gone 11 years now. They talked about being old, about what it feels like when the world keeps moving and you're not sure how fast you're supposed to move with it, about loneliness, that specific, quiet loneliness that can exist even when you're surrounded by people who love you, about what they still wanted, what they were still grateful for. Papa said it was the most honest conversation he'd had in years, maybe ever. On the morning of the 3rd day, Papa borrowed a phone from the shop on the corner. He called my mother, and when she answered, when she heard his voice, she couldn't speak for almost a full minute, just crying. He let her. He said, "I'm okay. I'm more than okay. I'll explain everything when I get home, but I need you to know I'm okay." And then he said something that my mother has repeated to me so many times since that I can hear it in her voice, even now. He said, "I went on the wrong train, but I think it took me exactly where I needed to go." He came home the next morning. We were all there, every single one of us. And when he walked through that door, brown bag, gray, flat cap, that particular straightness in his spine that never left him, nobody said anything clever. Nobody had the right words. We just held him, all of us, at once in that hallway. This old man at the center of all of us, holding us back just as hard.